First of all, I would like to say thank you, Russell Banks and Paul Schrader, to be with us. We wanted to organize this discussion, this conversation. It is not really a masterclass, it's more like a discussion between, as you said, two legends. And also because we like to hear artists discussing together. But first of all, among the numerous themes that we evocate together, I'm sure we are going to talk about the way you adapt literature into script and into cinema, the links you do between cinema and the world of literature. Maybe also we will talk about the way you consider France maybe as a source of inspiration, maybe or maybe not, I don't know. But first of all, I would like to have a word for Bertrand Tavernier, who wanted to be with us, and he couldn't come, unfortunately. And I know you are working now, Russell Banks, with him on a script. And you told me a few days ago that Bertrand Tavernier told you that the way he does the script, he does his way to write script, is not at all the way you do in Hollywood. We don't do that way. This is what he said. So maybe to introduce the first question would be, so do you think there is a main difference between a French scriptwriter and an American scriptwriter, as you, both of you?
Well, I don't have vast experience. The only experience I have working with a French director-writer is with the Bertrand. And we began, it's an adaptation of a short story of mine, and he wanted to make it, it's set in the United States, in Miami primarily, and he wanted to make it an American film with American actors and so on. He needed me to co-write it with him. And he sat me down in Paris and said, I don't do it the way they do it in Hollywood. And I said, well, I don't know the way they do it in Hollywood, but how do you do it?
How did he imagine they do it in Hollywood?
The three-act screenplay, fitting a very clear and predefined template, a treatment that went from beginning to end before you. He said, I like to write one scene at a time and get it right, and that it will tell me what the next scene will be, and then I'll write that one, and then it will tell me what the next
I wouldn't
scene.
work that way, but I mean, I know the point. I did a film in Romania a couple of years ago, and I was talking to the cinematographer. He was one of the gods of new Romanian cinema. And he had agreed to do my film, and then he finally backed out. And he said, because I said, what I like about Romanian films at that time, new Romanian films, is you never know what's going to happen, whether the movie's going to end now or keep going. And in American films, you can feel the arc. Mm-hmm. And that is somewhat what you're talking about now.
Yeah, and this was the fact that it was a short story too made it more interesting, because we had to expand a 10-page story into a 2-hour film, rather than shrinking or eviscerating a novel to make a 2-hour film.
Well, I mean, I think one of the most important developments for storytellers is, of course, long form now, because we were dying about 5 years ago from just this disease, the mechanics of the 3-act structure. It felt like these rusty, clunky old gears. It was like the Lionsgate logo. You could just hear it going. You could hear the roller coaster going up, 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 up. You know, you could hear all the gears working. And what long form did is just freed you from the gears. And you could put the high point of a scene in the middle of an episode. In fact, they liked it better that way. You could digress. You could sort of wander off into a minor character for an hour or two. And that has made writing so much better, because we were imprisoned by this dreadful man, well, what's his name, Robert McKee, you know, with this dreadful notion that you can figure it out. You know, well, some stories are 3 acts. That's because we tend to think of past, present, future, so we tend to think in 3s. But some are 5 acts. Some are 1 act, you know, and a story will tell you how many acts it is, But that McKee thing is probably one of the worst things that I know. If you teach screenwriting, which I do from time to time, you have to. Part of it has to be unteaching that book.
Yeah.
Can you tell us, Mr. Paul Schrader, how did you work together the first time you've met and the first time maybe you've read the novels of Russell Banks? How did you work together then?
You remember, Paul, when you called me and we had finally agreed that you would buy the rights to Affliction. Then you said, "Now I want you to write the screenplay," and I said, "You got to be kidding! You're the best screenwriter in America. Why do you want me to write the screenplay?" And you said, "Because you'll work cheaper than I do."
Well, I don't remember.
Then I said, "No, I won't. What do you get? I'm going to get that much too." And then you wrote it.
Well, it was written on spec, so I wasn't getting anything. But I mean, that book grabbed me, and but the thing about an adaptation is not you becoming the vehicle for the author of the novel. It's you finding your story within that novel and you pushing it through, so that the ultimate satisfaction of writing a good adaptation is that the author is satisfied, maybe not happy, but satisfied. But you feel that you've found something that means something to you too. And often when you read a book, there are multiple screenplays inside that book. And you have to find the one that really means something to you. And one of the reasons that so many adaptations go awry is because the writers are now getting instructions as to what is important and what isn't. And therefore, you're asking the writer to be nothing but a technician. But in the case of Affliction, it was a very easy adaptation. It just opened itself up for adaptations. The length was right, the voice was right,
Although it's a very subjective narrative. I mean, it's told from the point of view of a minor character, and so it's internal in that sense. It wasn't a really highly visual story.
Yeah, I mean, I remember it not being a difficult task. Here's how I work. I believe that screenwriting is part of the oral tradition, not part of the literary one. Screenwriting, in fact, is not literature. It's just me telling you a story. We went hunting and a dog got sick and the bird got away. That's a screenplay. So I start telling the story. And every time I tell it, I re-outline it, and I tell it again and re-outline it. And you tell it to anybody, "Hey, you want some coffee here? I'll buy you a drink. And let me tell you a story." Okay, these two men are sitting there in Ellen Burton's Center. One of them is a famous author, and the other has a heart condition, and he thinks he's going to die, but he's trying to hang on. Okay, boom! I started a story. Here we go. And just you make it up, and then you re-outline it, tell it again, re-outline it, and every time you tell it, you look at the person's eyes. You don't care what they think, but what you do care is you have them. And if I have you, I have you. I know it. And if I don't have you, I can see it in your posture. I can see it in your eyes, and I've got to do something to get you back. And all of a sudden, a red convertible pulls up with two huge black guys in purple suits, and they get out with guns. Bingo! I got you back. What am I going to do with those two linebackers? I don't know yet, but I know I got you. Yeah. Now I got to deal with these linebackers. And so that's how you do it. And finally, when you get to the point where you can tell somebody a story for 45 minutes and hold their interest, you have a movie. And then you can write it. And so for me, the major work in writing a screenplay is oral. Just telling, outlining. And then the writing period usually is 3 to 4 weeks, because it's all up here in your head anyway. And I'll just finish this by saying this is two things happen if you tell your story enough. One of two things. And they're both good things. One is the story, it dies on you. And it just dies. You can feel it die. Well, that's a good thing because you don't have to waste 6 months writing a script that nobody wants to see. Or if the story gets sick of being told and says, enough already, I want to be in print now. I want to go. And then, of course, you go like lightning. So, and when I teach screenwriting, I essentially teach that method. Now, that's not what I think Bertrand is talking about either.
No, not at all. When the first time I had to write you just reminded me of something, a screenplay. It was for an adaptation of one of my own books, and I had never written one before, and I had barely even read one before. And I didn't know how to budget my time, how much time I was going to have to give up from my other writing, my real writing, as I think of it. And so I happened to know him well enough to call Elmore Leonard. And I said, how long should I budget for writing a screenplay? And he said, if you're doing it longer than 6 weeks, you're doing it wrong. He said, but don't tell them that. Just go ahead and do it. So I budgeted 6 weeks, and that was. Yeah.
And regarding, I don't know if you can talk about method. You use this word method, but regarding your work, Russell Banks, what is according to you the main thing to avoid when you're adapting?
Well, I don't know about adapting. I wanted to respond to one thing he said about telling and retelling and retelling. For a novelist, for a fiction writer, certainly, and I think as well as short story writer, it's important not to tell the story. Advice from Hemingway on down and from every fiction writer is don't talk your story out, and you won't write it, and also you will never really discover very much in the process of telling your story. So I'll work 3 years on a novel, and I won't even tell my wife what it's about.
Wow. But here's the difference: a film is in a fixed time frame. A novel is in an open time frame.
Yeah.
You can set a novel down. You can read it over the course of days, weeks, sometimes months. You can only see a film in the time frame that has been allotted. So that if you have a good scene on page 35, which is now landing on page 45, it's no longer a good scene. Mm-hmm. It's 10 pages too late, and you've got to do something about that in terms of your timing. Mm-hmm. Whereas many, I would assume, most authors have a feeling for when people are going to stop reading and pick it up again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, too, you have the constraint of other people much more present in your work life, I mean, your creative life in film than you do in fiction. If I take 3 years to write a novel, no one else is participating in that process. I'm alone. I'm like... I like to compare sometimes the making of a novel is like the making of a large pot out of a lump of clay, mm-hmm. or more than a lump, and that has a flat base but is rounded all the way up, and that's you're controlling every aspect of the shape of color and meaning of that pot. And then a filmmaker comes along and throws the pot on the ground, breaks it up into 1,000 pieces, and then shuffles through the pieces to find the flat ones, just the flat ones. It leaves all the round ones out. But the filmmaker also is coming with other people and starts to reassemble those flat pieces into the equivalent, let's say, of a stained glass window. A three-dimensional object becomes a two-dimensional object. Three-dimensional object made by one person becomes a two-dimensional object made by a guild of people. You've got to have the guy who does the leading, you've got to have the person who designs the picture, you've got to have the frame around it, and so forth. It's that radically different.
I was just asking if there are things to avoid regarding the adaptation.
I think a too literal loyalty to the source is the main thing to avoid. Well, you can speak to that, Paul, better than I.
Well, I mean, a novel by definition is too long. I mean, a screenplay is anywhere from 90 to 110 pages, and a novel is going to be 4 to 5 times longer than that. So you're just going to go in and pick out little shards of stuff and reassemble them, just like he said. So this idea that you can be faithful to a novel in a limited time frame, I don't, you know, the idea that you can make a film out of Grapes of Wrath, the idea is so daunting. I would much rather adapt a short story than I would a long novel.
And some people say that your novels, Russell Banks, are very cinematographic, very visual. Do you agree?
It's not. I've heard this. Yes, it's not intentional any means, but I do think it may be a result of an aspect of my writing process, which I held to partly on principle and partly by accident from the beginning, which is that first of all, I really want to be able to see what I'm writing. Joseph Conrad said, he said, above all else, I want my reader to see. And he meant it in a literal sense, not to understand it. That he meant to see, literally visualize what was on the page. And I think that the writer, I do anyhow, need to see it before I can say it, in a sense. Or in the saying, see it. And so I think my work is probably easier for readers to visualize than much other work. Not necessarily better or worse. It's just an aspect of the work.
Well, here's an interesting question. So for the past 100 years, novelists have been permeated with images they've learned from the silver screen, and they can't divest themselves of all that imagery. And when you start to read their books, you start to see that imagery coming up. All of a sudden you say, "Oh, this is like Apocalypse Now," but some academic person should try to make the case of, did novels become more visual after cinema? Flaubert, Stendhal, all those people, were they more or less visual than their film counterparts? I don't know the answer to that, but you can make that your class paper.
And Mr. Schrader, when you've read Affliction, for instance, did you get the images right at the instance you've been reading the pages?
Well, I mean, there's the dominant image in the novel is the burning down of the barn, which is a very, very cinematic image, which you think of Faulkner, the barn burner in Faulkner, and then of course the other images is of cold, just the white landscape, and these sort of figures wrapped up in a cold landscape, sort of trying to communicate, but it's almost like they have too much clothes on to communicate.
But they were in the novel. Yeah. I mean, the novel is those are the clusters of images that lead up to the barn burning, the fire at the end, which is also a kind of a Viking ship in a way, because there's a dead body inside it.
Yeah, the one thing we couldn't afford, the most cinematic thing in the book, was when the truck breaks through the ice and goes into the lake, and then it has to be pulled out. We ended up shooting on a lake and spinning out, but the process of breaking through the lake, sinking the truck, was beyond our budgetary abilities. Although I did see on YouTube I saw that scene on YouTube. Somebody actually goes on the lake and their truck goes down. So long.
It happens all the time in the North Country.
But so sometimes those great visuals, you can't do them, and we only had one barn, so it had to work the first time, unlike Tarkovsky, who was able to come back 6 months later, build a new barn.
Yeah. It's funny, in the Suite Hereafter, there's a vehicle that goes through the ice as well. I just realized that, gee, I must be a little hung up on sinking vehicles through ice. The school bus goes down in through ice, but they did that digitally. It was the most expensive part of the whole movie.
And is it possible to say one word about American Darling? Is this the novel that is adapted right now? I don't know if it.
I tried.
Yes,
I worked with
it was
Denis
supposed to be
Villeneuve.
adapted by.
Yeah, Denis
Scorsese.
Villeneuve was going to do it. I worked with him. It got complicated. We both struggled with it. I was writing it and with him and for him really and then because I loved his early work quite a lot and he loved the book, so it was a comfortable and a good personal relationship as well, and it still is. But at some point there in the middle of the process, which was it's a very difficult book to adapt. It's a whole first-person narrator by a woman and telling her story to a stranger. And at some point in there, Denise suddenly was offered the whole cake, and this was going to be a very difficult movie to make, dark and aggressive, and it was going to be expensive. It was going to have to be shot in Africa, and it's in the Liberian Civil War in the late 80s and 90s, and so he had to abandon the project. Since then, no one has picked it up. It sits there like half a dozen others of my books, waiting for somebody brave or foolish enough to try to adapt it to film.
So at this time, no one will adapt it right now.
Not at the moment, no.
Before maybe
Unless someone here was interested,
Yeah.
we can talk afterwards.
before the audience can, of course, ask question. Maybe a question about France. Martin Scorsese says that French cinema is a kind of inspiration for him. Is there anything
Well,
among
I mean,
the French cinema or among the French culture or the French writers that can be inspiring for you, both of you?
well, for me, because I came to films as an adult and didn't see films until I was an adult, a college student, and what you saw in French cinema, was these three kind of strains at the same time. One was the great humanistic tradition of Renoir, who then I got to know in Los Angeles, and he was a very, very seductive man. He just sort of, you felt the world expanding as you talked to him. And the other is the recklessness of the Nouvelle Vague. We can do anything. There are no rules for us. But then, most important for me was Bresson, who was that lonely light in the darkness that only he could throw the light. And I had an epiphany in March of 1969. I went to a critical screening at Los Feliz in Los Angeles of Pickpocket. I was going to review it. I was reviewing for the LA Free Press. I subsequently reviewed it for 2 weeks running. And I watched this movie. It's only 75 minutes long. And during this film, I had two thoughts. One was, there is a bridge between my profane present, I was a film student at UCLA, and my sacred past, I had come from seminary. And it's a bridge of style, not a bridge of content. There is such a thing as a transcendental style. It hit me. And then 2 years later, I wrote a book on that subject. The other thing that hit me was I didn't think there was any place for me in filmmaking. I was a film critic. I was a very serious film critic, a protege of Pauline Kael's. We will tell you when you make a good movie. That was sort of my attitude toward filmmakers. And I was living with group of students that who were UCLA filmmakers, and they were shooting a biker film for Corman. And I just thought this was so declassé, and there would be no place for me to work in such a debased industry. And then I saw this film. And I said, wait a second. He writes in his journal, then he goes out and he steals something, writes in his journal, goes and talks to his neighbor, writes in his journal, the police come and visit him. I said, I could make a movie like that. And 3 years later, I wrote Taxi Driver, which is that movie. And then 50 years later, those two threads, one which sprouted the academic transcendental style, and the other one which sprouted the anarchic Taxi Driver, finally meet, in this film. Came out last year, First Reformed. So, in that 75 minutes at the Los Feliz Theater, my life was decided. And then I went to France to interview Bresson, and I was writing him, and he would not consent to an interview. And finally, his wife wrote me and said, I've told him that he has to do it. And so I went. I was going en route to Cannes, where Taxi Driver was being shown, and I interviewed him. It was in film comment, a completely wacky interview. I asked some questions, he gave some answers. They did not line up at all. But what I remember is the last line of the interview was, he says to me, do you think your film will win the big prize? Meaning the Palme d'Or. And I said, yes. And it was my first script. And it wins the Palme d'Or. I mean, the arrogance, the hubris of just being that young.
But the French are never arrogant.
No.
And according to you, Russell Banks, I know that regularly you come to France and you have discussion with writers, French writers, and
various artists of various types. I know. Well, I've been very fortunate that the French seem to have a special affection for my work, and I've also been fortunate because I have a great French publisher and translator. I mean, you're in the hands of a translator and publisher when you travel out of your own language and Actes Sud, and Pierre Furlan has been my translator for 25, 30 years now, and so all credit to them. But it also is a peculiarity, I think, of the French, that they have such an affection for my work, which I think of as kind of American in many ways, and very much rooted in the tradition of American realism. And American mode of storytelling, rather than the French mode of storytelling. It's rather different. It's not theoretically driven. It's not autobiographically based, and these are uncharacteristic in the canon, the French canon, and aspects. So it has surprised them, but I must say it certainly has pleased me, because I love going over. I have many dear friends there, and I love eating French food and drinking French wine and selling books. So it's always been a pleasurable experience for me. But to go back to the question Paul was answering too, because there is a film, a French film that has had an impact on me that's similar to Bresson, which was 400 Blows, which we've been screening here and talking about, and I wrote a little essay about here. And it's one of those things that happened. I was probably a few years younger than you. It was 1959. I was 19 years old, and I was living in Boston as a kind of wannabe poet, a writer, but mainly just a loser, dropout, beatnik, trying to get by with petty crimes and not much else. And I had no experience of films other than the conventional American films of the late 50s, middle late 50s, the ones that got to the screens in small town America. And a friend directed me to the Exeter Theater in Boston, where they were screening 400 Blows. And I walked in and saw that film, and within about 5 minutes or so, I thought, oh, this black and white movie set in Paris in the 50s about a French kid is really about me. There's a subjectivity to that film, and I recently saw it again after not having seen it for many, many, many years, and it's still as mysterious to me now as it was then. How I was allowed to enter into the subjective experience of this boy who, on the surface of things, was so different from me, an urban kid, yes, lower middle class as I was, but other than that, we had nothing in common. And yet, something about that film has a quality that I had up to that point only seen in fiction, in novels that would draw you into the subjective inner experience simply by describing behavior. And that film did that for me. And I think over the years, as I became then much more enthusiastic and a visitor to French films, I think it probably did have a quality that I learned from as a fiction writer. The correspondence, for instance, to me in time, and just to stay with 400 Blows, where it's quick cutting and then long shots, and quick cutting and long shots correspond to my experience of time. And that kind of pacing is very useful for a novelist to have, to adhere to in a way. Find a pacing that isn't necessarily dictated by the number of pages, but rather by the subjective felt experience of time. And I began to realize that, wait a minute, there's a quality of the mimesis of time is something that's very central to novels. It imitates the flow of time, such that, and this experience, I experienced this with the film too. With a novel, unlike a short story, about 75 pages into it, you forget the beginning, just as in the flow of time. You don't remember the first part of your life, and the point is to forget it. It's a river that flows. And those films managed, just through that kind of alternating pacing, to acquire that verisimilitude, really, to our felt experience of time.
A river that flows. Yes. Is there any question? You want the mic? Yeah.
For Paul, have you read any of the novelizations of your scripts? And is there a dream novel that you select with that?
There was a tendency in the 70s to have original scripts novelized. And I wanted no part of this myself. And my brother did. Well, it was easy money, you know. My brother did one, and another writer did one of Taxi Driver, who he gave an interview shortly thereafter saying how much better his novelization was than my script. But happily that trend has died. It's a really bastardized way to, stick a few coins in your pocket, but nothing else good came of it. But it begs the larger question. Russell and I were talking earlier. There was a period, which both he and I remember, where serious books got made into serious movies on a regular basis. And 2-3 times a month you would see a serious movie in the movie screens. Now, if you see 2-3 a year, that's about what we're down to. And even the TV long form tends not to address the serious films. Long form would be ideal for Crime and Punishment, and they have done it in Russia, but they aren't going to do it here. So that Jean Le Carré and Gone Girl, they get the long form, but they're just pop literature. So we have not only has the novel more or less died, but the literary adaptation of the novel has kind of died with it. And there was a period there where, the big book, had to be whoever wrote it, whether it was Joseph Heller or Ernest Hemingway, you wanted to see that movie on the screen. And what happened?
Well, what happened, I think, in many cases was that the adaptations of serious work weren't serious themselves. I mean, you look at Beloved, for instance, and any number of others you could name that are serious books, but when adapted, turned into potboiler movies.
Do you have any title in mind?
Well, I was thinking of Beloved in particular, yeah. Toni Morrison's novel, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, even those Faulkner things, or the Flannery O'Connor things, there's a seriousness in there that's gone. Even when they turn, what's the one with Newman and Long Hot Summer, whatever, what's it called? What? Yeah. I mean, underneath there's Faulkner somewhere. But even those don't get made.
Don't you think that has more to do with the economics of film than with the culture itself? I mean, every time, Paul and I usually get together once a year in the summertime for a nice long weekend, and one of Paul's, it seems, compulsions when he comes to visit me is to tell me how the novel is dead.
Take your friend Bill Kennedy, Ironweed. Yeah. Would Ironweed be made today into a film?
Highly unlikely. I can't imagine it. You're right. I understand that. But that's something about, you're talking about film, not about the novel, not about fiction, because I think serious fiction is still continuing to be written and published, sometimes with great difficulty and so on.
Part of the economic engine of those films, of those books from the 50s, 60s, 70s, was they were always trying to sell them to the movies. Right. And then you had agents who specialized in getting the copies first, and that seems to have dried up.
I don't know. I don't think so, actually. There are all these movie deals that are made before the book is even published. Yeah. I think that there is there. I just think it's in the nature of movie making today that it nuance, complexity, conflicted moralities. There's not much room for that in film today. Whereas novels thrive on it. That's what they're about.
Well, there's certainly not room in big budget films anymore. I mean, one of the foundational articles of French cinema is by Alexandre Astruc in '48, where he wrote about the camera stylo, the idea that there you could be an auteur and a camera could be a pen. Now, that really wasn't possible then. It is possible now. Anybody can make a film. Anybody. Yeah. You have a camera stylo in your pocket already. Yeah. That's the good news. And so there's a bounty of very, very interesting films being made now. A tsunami of them. They're all very, very low budget, but voices we've never heard from before. Cultures we've never heard from. Everybody's making a film. That's the good news. Yeah. The bad news is nobody's making a living. Yeah. And so it is now possible to make a film for $10,000. And it's also possible to lose $10,000 making that same film. Yeah. Whereas in the past, if you made a film, you got paid. Yeah. Because that was the nature of the film economics. Right. Today, filmmakers are now like poets and painters and musicians. You can work for nothing, and many of them do.
We have other questions, sir.
This is like I guess a comment / question. I had to just research this on the web, but the comment is: have you seen a very on topic to this? Have you seen a French film that was made in this sort of from a novel, I believe, starring the most gifted actress in the world, practically Audrey Tautou, Mood Indigo. Wasn't that from a novel?
I don't know.
Familiar with that?
I don't know. I don't think I've seen it, no.
I believe it was, yes.
Oh.
It's
Yeah.
like right on the topic here.
The best adaptation I saw this year was from a novel.
Is it from L'écume des jours de Boris Vian? Is that?
Yeah.
Is it? Yeah. Okay.
The best adaptation, I'd like to just put in a word for it that I saw, because the film seemed to have been overlooked by and large. It's called We the Animal. And I just thought it was fabulous. And I don't know what it cost to make, but probably very little. Most of it's set in a double wide in the woods, but and most of it's with children. But boy, it's brilliant. And so I went out and read the novel, which is I rarely do. Usually I read the novel first and then see the film. In this case, I went out and read the novel, and it's a brilliant little novel too. It's fantastic. I recommend it to all of you. That's a case of it's almost a kind of old-fashioned now independent film adaptation.
We the animals.
We the Animal, yeah.
Other questions? Remarks? Sir?
Can we just get that second question that he asked of Paul Schrader about what his dream adaptation would be that you haven't done yet?
Oh, what, an adaptation? I'd have to give that a little more thought. Usually, you know, if it's really a great book, you stand away from it. You know, how do you adapt Lolita? Well, and if you're Kubrick, you figure it out. If you're Adrian Lyne, you don't. I tend to work on spec on my own little shop and come up with my things. You have the rare occasion where you're in a bookstore and you happen to pick up a book and the book jumps off the shelf at you and chases you down the sidewalk. But I can't think of any books I have in there that I really wanted to do. You know, like Scorsese, you know, he had 3 books he wanted to do from the day I first met him. He wanted to do Gangs of New York, Last Temptation of Christ, and Silence. Now, he got to do all 3, but he's not a writer. So if you're a writer, I don't want to do Gangs of New York. I don't want to do Silence. I don't want to do Last Temptation of Christ. I want to do Taxi Driver, Light Sleeper, First Reformed. I want to do my own ones, you know. And so it's very rare that you find a book that just drives you in that way. And then, of course, the moment you get involved with a book, you get involved often with a tangle of rights situations. Sometimes the book has been previously optioned and had weight on it. And all of a sudden, you have a book that has $500,000 of weight on it, and now you're trying to do it. So that's why I prefer to work on spec.
Another question? Yeah.
Hi. So this question is for both Paul and Russell. I just found out 2 hours ago that there's actually a theater adaptation of Crime and Punishment that is 80 minutes long, which is very crazy to me because I don't know how you'd be able to tell that story in 80 minutes. So it's probably not good then.
Wait, what story?
What is?
Oh.
Yeah. But anyways, I'm just wondering, so in relation to the medium of theater, if someone were to offer a theater adaptation of either of your stories, would you say yes, or do you think would that even be possible?
They have, and I have said no.
Cool.
Why?
I mean, the Taxi Driver is the main example. People keep wanting to do it. Leave the film alone. It has had a wonderful life. Don't fuck with it. Just let it be. Don't try to do it again. And we got lucky the first time and let it be. Yeah, but sometimes, money gets involved. They wanted to do they wanted to do a TV series on American Gigolo, which I just thought was a dreadful idea. And I still think it's a dreadful idea, and I don't think it will ever see the light of day. So I took $50,000 because I said, this is never going to get made. I better take the money. But they only paid me on the condition that I would not be involved. Because they approached me and said, we want to do American Gigolo as a TV series. I said, that's a terrible, terrible idea. Times have changed. Those times are gone now. We're in the internet age. We're in the, in the what do they call those parties that for women give for themselves? There's a Brit term for it.
Me too?
What?
No, sorry.
It's like the female equivalent of a bachelor party. Hen party.
Oh.
Okay, we're in the age of hen parties now. So that's kind of a post-American Gigolo era. and so after I tried to convince them that it was a bad idea, they said that I couldn't be involved.
But what would you do, and it's a question for both of you, if Netflix come and offer you an amount of dollars and you can do what you want, what would you do?
And they could do what they wanted with it. I mean, would I sign it off? No, I haven't. I've always restrained myself from just signing it off. I so enjoyed working with filmmakers over the years. Because they have themselves been artists and respectful of the essential nature of the material, and their work has been really interesting. Their work as filmmakers to me, with Adam McGoyan or Paul, or I worked with Francis Coppola on a project for a while. I've worked with Denis Villeneuve and Raoul Peck, and now Bertrand Tavernier. I've been very lucky, but I've also been very choosy. And I haven't just sold the rights to adapt my work without being respectful of, without having admiration and respect for the person who is going to make that film. So I wouldn't just sell it to a company like Netflix, where then they would be in control of who was going to make that film.
Also, I don't think you should make a film for too much money. Like this film, First Reformed, one of the reasons it took me so long to make it is the economics weren't right. So if I had tried to make that film 20, 30 years ago, it would have lost a lot of money. We made it in 20 days 2 years ago. Back then it would take 45 days. So it would cost twice as much. And the economics weren't right. And, if you make a very specialized film and you make it for too much money, it doesn't work because you feel the obligation of having taken too much money and having spent too much money, and you start making compromises when you're not even aware that you're making compromises. So that, when I finally wrote that script, I felt free to write it because I could say to someone, this is a responsible financial investment. This is going to cost $3 million. I'm going to get Ethan to do it. You're going to get your money back. And of course, I used to say that in the past, but I was lying. But this time I could say it and actually tell the truth.
Some more questions? Yes, sir?
I just wanted out, since crime and punishment has come up a couple of times, that's sort of the source for pickpocketing.
Well, no, it's Notes from the Underground really is more. I think the foundational novel, the foundational existential novel is Notes from the Underground. And out of that comes L'Étranger and the nausea and the whole, evil fruited tree of existentialism.
So is that sort of, but you sort of, you probably acknowledge, but it's certainly been said that you've remade Pickpocket a bunch of times, and I'm just wondering if you sort of feel like Notes of the Underground or Dostoevsky is sort of behind, or maybe Bernanos, you know, in First Reform, it seemed like maybe Diary of a Country Priest is.
Yeah, and Winterlight is in there and other things. I took a shot at Notes from the Underground when I was just starting out, and I didn't feel that it was a little too on the mark. It wasn't off the mark enough, and so that to be true to the book, I think you would have been a mistake. So you can actually make Notes from the Underground without even referencing any part of that story. You just skew it off, you know, and you make these occupational metaphors are great metaphors. Taxi driver, drug dealer, gigolo, society walker, minister. You know, if you can find an occupational metaphor that lines up with a problem in your own life, you know, the battle isn't over, but the battle is enjoined. And once it's enjoined, it will be over.
One last question, maybe? Yes?
Just curious. Just curious, when you both are adapting novels, do you read the novel once and then set it aside while you're writing it, or will you consistently go back while you're writing it and reference it, almost like halfway?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you what I do with it. I adopted Mosquito Coast. And the first thing, you read the book once. You underline a few things, but mostly you're just reading it. And then you get out the legal pad, and you write down every single thing that happens. 1, 2, 3. Now, in a book like Mosquito Coast, a lot of things happen. In Last Temptation of Christ, many things happen. And you fill up pages of these. So that there were probably around 350 things happen in Last Temptation of Christ. In a movie, 40 to 50 things happen. So now you have some kind of dimension of what you're dealing with. And then so you start making check marks. I'm going to talk about this quite literally. So you have different themes. You know, the theme of sexuality, or the theme of God's voice, whatever it is, the theme of American entrepreneurship. And you start going behind each scene and start checking. You know, which scenes have what things in them? Comic relief, action, you know, male-female romance or conflict. And now you have maybe several hundred scenes with all little check marks behind them. And now you start looking at which scenes have the most check marks. And I said, well, these are all the scenes, you know. Well, let me just take out all those scenes. How many are there? I said, well, maybe 35, 40. Okay, let me just put them in a row. And now, let me look at that and say, how much of the other stuff do I have to fit in here? Because one of the secrets for me of creation is how to be additive rather than be subtractive. How do you, the mind is open when it has freedom to move. The mind hunkers down when it's being restricted. So if you have a 150-page script that has to be a 100-page script, you're in the wrong mindset. If you have a 75-page script that has to be a 90-page script, you're in great. So the shorter you can start, then put yourself in the additive mindset, the more freedom you're going to have. It's the same thing when you edit a film. At some point, say to the editor, let's cut out every scene except the ones that work. How long is the movie? It's about 45 minutes long. Okay, let's screen that 45 minutes and then figure out how much of the other stuff we have to put in. And once you are thinking of adding rather than subtracting, you find yourself much more originally stimulated. And so in some way, when you're tackling a novel, you're trying to get it down to the point where an additive process can lift it up again. So, because if you only think of subtracting, you're diminishing the novel, you're diminishing yourself, everything is becoming shorter, and that's no way to be free.
This is why working with a short story form was so much more gratifying for me than adapting a novel. I don't know why more short stories aren't adapted to film, because it does force you into that additive mode very quickly, and you have room to keep on expanding. And backstory, new characters, a minor character becomes major, and so forth. You can do so much more.
Yes?
Have you ever, while adapting, have you ever run into a situation where you pick up these themes within this novel and the author doesn't agree with you?
Well, I mean, the author's taking money. And, you know, and unless he is unexperienced or pesky, he sort of knows what that means. You know,
Please go away.
and so, you know, an author should only be in the stew when it's good for the stew. I personally don't think a writer should be on set. You know, I think if you haven't done your job at the end of rehearsals, there's something wrong with you as a writer, because you've got to hand that football off, and these people are going to play with it. And if they're still shooting this movie saying, what would he say here, what would he do here, you haven't done your job. And so in the same way, I think the novelist has done his job when he sits down and talks with you and gives you his opinion. He's done his job. And whether or not he agrees with you or not, you know, that's your call.
Do you go on the shootings?
I
the
have,
sets?
yes, I have, yes. But again, it goes back to what I was saying to an earlier question about being sure that the people I'm working with I have respect and admiration for, and that creates a friendship relationship, kind of relationship, a relationship of trust, which Paul was bypassing, describing the absence of trust in a way. And if the relationship is one of trust, as I did with Paul and as I did with Egoyan and so on, with Tavernier, then I think that you feel like you're able to be a participant. I remember, Paul, you sent me every draft of the script as you went through it. I was in the editing room with you. You showed me early screenings, and we went over them and sat there and talked about it together. I mean, you invited me into the process in a way. Had I known you felt about it the way you just described, I probably don't know. Would have mistrusted it, but. Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we were supposed to have a 1 hour discussion. So if there is no more questions, I'm sorry to interrupt, and maybe to have one final word of you, Russell Bung, since you're still the ambassador of the festival.
Well, in my remarks the other night, I rejected the designation as ambassador and substituted for it honored guest, and I have felt like an honored guest, and I'm very grateful to you all for that. It's been great, and I also want to personally thank Paul for stepping in for Bertrand here today. It's he's been on a whirlwind 1.5-year tour, and we were lucky he was in town and had enough energy left to show up here this afternoon.
Thank you, Paul Schrader. Thank you, Russell Banks. Thank you. And enjoy the beautiful films you can discover during this festival. Have a nice evening.